You're listening to Forging Fluidity with Savannah Wishart and Griffin Coombs, where we humbly navigate the idea of primal purpose, exploring conversations around physical, psychological, and spiritual well-being on the quest for a truly conscious and meaningful human experience. This week's focus is on physical fitness and in particular functional training. You'll hear us speaking as professional fitness coaches as we dissect and challenge some of the foundational ideas of the industry in a way that you won't hear on your everyday fitness podcast. What does it actually mean to be functional? Why are our bodies built the way they are? Which movement patterns are human beings really meant to practice to be healthy, strong, and pain-free? Is there a better way to look at how we train? Join us as we explore these questions and more in this conversation, and please remember to subscribe to the podcast and share it with others. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments on this episode, so let's waste no time. Enjoy the conversation.
Welcome back to week 5 of Forging Fluidity with myself, Savannah Wishart, and my co-host, Griffin Coombs.
Hello, hello.
Today, we are going to go into Griffin's expertise on functional movement as an animal flow instructor, breath coach, and general functional fitness guru. Both myself and Griffin really prioritize movement within both of our personal lives and support clients in our professional coaching work. Griffin, however, really shines with his expertise in unpacking the science behind primal movement, functional fitness, and everything in between, how to weave together your movement with breath, and so many different layers of just how to be a naturally mobile human. So before we get started with today's conversation, if Griffin, you'd like to introduce to the audience exactly what your background is with training, athleticism, and what your current certifications look like and where your expertise stems from.
Sure. Thank you for that great introduction. It's really cool to be talking about this stuff on this podcast because, as you know, I love this stuff. I eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. And I also really love all the other stuff that we talk about. So linking how important movement is to me and movement as the key or one of the keys to freedom and to connection to self is kind of a perfect merging of ideas for this podcast. So credentials wise and just history wise, I grew up not super athletic. I was a martial artist since I was 10 years old, 9 or 10 years old. And so I did traditional martial arts up through until I was about in high school. And I skateboarded a bit in high school, but I never played team sports. And I grew up in the Boston area and team sports were huge. So I was a little bit of an outcast in that regard. I had a fine upbringing. It didn't really harm me, but I just wasn't in this kind of jock team sport culture that most boys growing up were, at least where I grew up. And I didn't really get into fitness for the sake of fitness until I was in college. And I just decided, my weight fluctuated, but I was always a little bit chubby, a little bit overweight, never in particularly good shape. And I just started kind of experimenting and I didn't know what I was doing. I would try some free weights and some machines at the gym. I was embarrassed to ask for help. I went on some runs sometimes and I ended up getting really into running for a while. And then I found P90X, that famous home workout program. I went through that a couple times and started to understand that approach. And that was, 2008 or 2009 is when I discovered the paleo movement or primal approach to fitness via Mark Sisson and his the Primal Blueprint and all of that. So that was the first time where I started looking at fitness through like an ancestral lens and thinking, wow, this makes so much intuitive sense. And so the ethos there was, at the time anyway, I haven't been keeping up with the Primal Blueprint or any of the hardcore primal paleo ethos these days. But back then, at least, it was sprint once in a while, lift heavy things a couple times a week, and do a lot of low level aerobic activity. And then there was the nutrition and kind of the other lifestyle stuff. And so I started experimenting with that, but I was young and I didn't quite buy into the just once in a while thing. And I didn't really buy into the low level activity thing. And I just did a lot of, I sort of taught myself how to lift heavy, which was a bad idea. So I hurt my low back in my early 20s. And I did a lot of metabolic conditioning, like high intensity circuit training and HIIT workouts and things like that. And that was kind of the way that I trained for years and years. And until I just decided to get certified. And as at the same time I was getting certified, I was experimenting more with mobility, specifically mobility, and it was making me feel a lot better. And I had always wanted to be more flexible because of martial arts, but I had never really committed the time because, I had this attitude that was just like, I need to go hard all the time, and like, maybe some other time I'll work on stretching or mobility or whatever. And I just reached a point where I figured I had nothing to lose. I started to feel a little bit better. And then I was inspired by that shift to get certified. So I did certifications actually through ISSA, and I want to be super transparent because I have really strong opinions, and my certifications are through a company that does not require um, closed book test. Like, it's all an open book test, and it's all online, and the certification is a lot of head knowledge and not a lot of practical application. Um, what I do like about those certifications is that for your specializations, you have to do really involved case studies. So you either have to work from a case study or you have to design a case study or design plans for people. And that intellectual preparation for sessions is where most average, mediocre, or not so good trainers miss the mark. So it's not so much about, for your average trainer who could be better, it's not so much about what you're doing with the client. A lot of them are great relationally, and they can motivate and they can coach really well. But the intellectual preparation on how to design a program and the why and down to every detail of what you program, that's something that's lacking, I think, in the industry. And so what I like about the ISSA certifications, people give them a lot of flack because, well, anyone can just take them. They're just online. But the degree to which you have to do that intellectual prep is huge. So I appreciated that. But the bottom line is that most of what I know is through rigorous, and I really mean rigorous. I mean, this is the stuff that I think about going to sleep. It's the first thing I think about and do physically when I wake up. It's the stuff I read about, I listen to podcasts about, I compare research articles about for fun. And much of what is taught in these certification courses is either outdated or just incorrect. And I know that that's a bold statement, but looking at this from so many different lenses, and I've looked at bodybuilding and CrossFit and functional patterns and animal flow and all of these, every corner you can imagine. And there are some commonalities that are good for people. And there are also things that are just not right. And we're really misleading people. And so that was kind of long-winded, but that's how I got from, a kind of overweight high school kid who didn't do sports to somebody who's basically telling clients what they should do to have a fit and free body.
What a great introduction. And first to say, we are here for bold statements, always.
That's so true. Oh, and I didn't say what my certifications are in personal training, of course, and then I have specializations in corrective exercise and yoga. I do have the accredited certificate for yoga as well, so it's not the same. The test is actually, it's monitored and proctored and not open book or anything like that. Still not the thing I'm most proud of, but it is technically accredited. Uh, Animal flow level 1, working on level 2 at this time. That was the hardest certification I had to do because that involves a rigorous understanding of how to perform and teach animal flow movements. And I'm a certified performance breathing coach through XPT. So those are kind of my main credentials. And now we're caught up.
Quite the array of credentials and expertise and background. And I really think that the listeners will agree that it's so nice to hear the imperfect process of where you've come from athletically from childhood and as a young adult to where you are today. And it really shows that it's not ever going to be a linear path. And even if you don't have that athletic background, you always have the opportunity to create that athletic future for yourself by whatever you choose to do in the present.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was having a conversation with a friend kind of recently about how the lack of athletic background helped shape my approach to training as an adult. I think it can be difficult sometimes for people who are used to growing up playing sports and having a coach kind of tell them what to do and have their why am I doing this, always being attached to performance for a sports game, which is wonderful in its own right. But as soon as that goes away, if you stop playing that sport in an organized way, then what do you have? First of all, what do you have for a motivation to train? And then what do you know about your training and what you're doing and why you're doing it if you don't have a coach telling you? So I think that an athletic background can be really beneficial for a lot of people, but can also end up leaving them searching once that sports career is over for them.
That's so true. And if you've always you mentioned the jock background. And so if you're looking at football players and soccer players and all of the kind of preppy athletes in high school, then I think it's safe to assume that their why, if they have a why, has always been pushed on them and external from their parents and then their coaches. And so they don't really know why they're doing what they're doing other than to get a scholarship. And at least for me, growing up and doing some team sports as well, I was never taught how to stretch properly or to lift weights properly or anything. So if you've been conditioned throughout childhood and adolescence to train wrong, then you're going to have so much unlearning to do as an adult. And that might be why we see such bad lifts happening in normal gyms.
I would agree with that, and I think some people who play sports, they have an intrinsic why. Some kids love the game and would play even if their parents and coaches weren't pushing them. I think in general there's a drive to perform that is not 100% that of the player most of the time, if we're going to generalize. And it's funny because in where I am now in my philosophy and my understanding of the human body is that if you are trying to optimize for one thing as a human, it should be forward locomotion. And that's what most team sports players are optimizing for, in the sense that your football, soccer, hockey are on skates, so it's not the same thing, but you're running down a field at some point. You're moving your body, uh, whether it's jogging, sprinting, or cutting laterally, like side to side. These are probably the most aligned goals with what the human body is supposed to do. And so I started a long time ago thinking, it's useless because all you're doing is optimizing for playing football. And when you're done playing football, that's not going to mean anything. And then as I get deeper and deeper into human evolution and biomechanics, it's like that's the one thing we should be optimizing for, is moving forward in space. That's why humans are built the way that they're built, on 2 feet moving forward. And I know you mentioned in a previous conversation that we had that there was a guy. What was his name? The guy
Michael
who's
Easter.
yes, who says that we're built for kind of carrying things. And I think that's fair. I don't think that there's a consensus on exactly how much walking versus running versus carrying humans were really evolved to do and what's optimal for us. I think some people, there's that famous book Born to Run by Chris McDougall. There's rucking or carrying things, and then there's walking. And I think the thing they all have in common is moving forward on 2 feet is what humans are supposed to do. So we want to train so that we optimize that function because we do that every single day, always. And if we're not walking properly, if we can't carry things functionally, if we can't run, then we're not human. And if what we're doing is getting in the way of that, that's probably a big problem.
So, would you say that the foundational pillar to functional fitness, in your definition, is the forward motion?
I would say that that's the athletic movement that you most want to optimize for. And unless you compete in a sport or you do an activity that is specialized and has its own needs that are not aligned with that. But if you are somebody who's training just because you want to be the fittest, healthiest, most functional human being that you can be, you're going to want your training to make you better at walking and running and carrying things.
Yep, makes sense. I'm curious what you think about counting steps then.
I actually think counting steps is great, especially for people who don't walk because they don't have any concept of what is a good amount of walking. I think 10,000 to 20,000 steps is optimal for
Mm-hmm.
humans. But if you have never counted steps or you're not active and you're just trying to figure out, okay, I need to walk a little bit more, then giving yourself a reference point is a great idea. I think eventually we don't really need it. It's just can be a helpful tool. And if you like counting your steps, totally fine, whatever. But I don't think that that's training. That's activity. And it's something that is we if you're optimizing as a human, meaning that you are as functional and just in a great state physically, walking is just something you do all the time, and it's not really considered training. Like training is something you're trying to do to get an adaptation out of your body to be better, and walking is just something that we do all the time. But
Hmm.
if you're really sedentary, maybe you're really overweight, you're deconditioned, I mean, you do absolutely nothing physical, then walking can feel like training, and that's okay at the start. But if we're looking at where we want to be in a place where training is training and walking is just the thing we do all the time, like talking, like breathing.
So, in that sense, our goal as active humans is to achieve a baseline where walking is our active lifestyle and the training exists in a specified container of time and space.
Yes, but that gets down to semantics more, where we're talking about what we're calling training versus what we're calling living. And that's kind of a fun philosophical question, but I don't want to get too deep down that rabbit hole for our listeners in this episode. But I will say that we want to establish a baseline of activity before we look at killing ourselves with training. So most people, when they think of training, they think of I'm either doing some sort of cardio and then I'm doing some sort of strength training and then I'm stretching, if I'm disciplined enough to take care of myself. And it's all, first of all, it's not that simple, but the even if that were kind of the best way to go about it, the problem is that you don't have an active lifestyle that you're building upon that if you're the average person. So you go to work, you sit in your car and you drive to work. If this is suburban America, right? You sit in your car, you go to work. You get out of your car, you walk to your seat and you sit at your desk for long periods of time and you get up and you go back to your car, you drive to the gym. Then you put in an hour, let's say, sometimes more, sometimes less, of intense work. And then you go home and then you sit on the couch, or you kind of slump over to the side and lie down on the couch, or you sit at the dinner table or whatever. So you really, and this sounds radical, but you really have no business doing high intensity training if you don't have the foundation of walking, if you don't have, if you're not able to access certain ranges of motion because you're sitting in the same position all the time, your joints and your tissues are not primed to just go in and start doing super intense stuff. And even if you feel like you can do it, if you can make the movement happen, your body is almost certainly compensating. And so the joints aren't functioning the way that they're supposed to be functioning, but you're just going to get that weight up however you're going to get that weight up, and that's going to mean different joints moving out of optimal position and different tissues taking over the job of other tissues. And it's because primarily, not because you're just bad at the lift, because your body is not adapted to going through those ranges. And so instead, instead of addressing that and integrating movement into our life that opens up those ranges and restores them to how they're supposed to be, we just keep a locked up, stiff, dysfunctional body that's out of position, and then we just put that under load, meaning adding weight to it or adding intensity to it. And that's a recipe for injury. I mean, most active people, highly active people who aren't thinking about this stuff get injured at some point, and they get re-injured. And most sedentary people they're not necessarily injured for that reason, but eventually in older age they get injured because they're not stimulating their musculoskeletal system at all. And so that's where knee replacements and hip replacements come in. Eventually the machine wears down if you don't use it. So either way, if you're not moving intelligently, it's a recipe for injury, whether it's now because you work too hard and you work the wrong way, or whether it's because you don't do anything and 20 years down the line you end up with having surgery on some major joint. So the answer to your question, I think, is it's not so much about calling it training versus activity. It's more about, is movement integrated into your lifestyle to the point where it's safe to train at a higher intensity? And if not, we have to put our egos to the side and we have to focus more on quality movement that's integrated with our everyday life and prioritize that more than we prioritize that 1 hour in the gym. So I heard there was one quote that's like, if you spend 1 hour in the gym, how you spend the other 23 hours of the day is what determines whether that 1 hour helps you or hurts you. And that couldn't be
I've
more
heard
true,
that
in my
quote.
opinion.
Yeah, I've heard that quote. And it just lines up with the consistency of your habits and how important they are to make you or break you. Sometimes literally, if you're going to
Yeah.
tear something.
Yeah, it's so true. And like it comes back with the honesty with the self also, because something that I used to go through was, if you feel like exercise is a compensation for eating poorly, let's say, like a lot of people are just like, oh, I got to burn off that piece of cake I ate last night, and that means I have to work out extra hard today. If you treat exercise as a punishment for poor eating, then you are never ever going to do the exercise that your body actually needs, because you're always going to be trying to play catch up with your nutrition habits. So you either need to get your nutrition habits in check so you don't feel like you need to there's nothing that you have to regret and exercise to burn off, when you should be having a much lower intensity workout that focuses on quality of movement and ingraining proper patterns. Or you eat the piece of cake and then you change your mindset about the relationship between exercise and nutrition. Ideally, you do both. Like, we're not eating a piece of cake every single day, and also we don't feel like exercise is a punishment for eating poorly. But it's so ingrained with self-honesty that when you start talking to clients about, or when I start to talk to clients, because I don't want to work with people whose goals aren't aligned with well-being. And sometimes there's conflict there where you the typical personal trainer is trained to say, what are your goals? And they say, I want to lose 15 pounds by the summer. And they're supposed to say, well, it sounds good, I can help you with that, and put them on like a fat loss program. And for me, my next question is why? And there's a lot of whys, because I want to know where your goal comes from. And if your goal ends up coming from a feeling of inadequacy, or, whatever, like some psychological need to look a certain way or to do a certain thing, that's fine. We're all human. But I want to help you change your goal to something that is more aligned with your true well-being. And so I'm not the type that's going to just accept whatever goal you have and say, that's great, I'm here to help. I'm here to help you redefine your goal so that the goal serves your well-being in the long run. And that's not for everyone.
No, it's not. And it's also not a common approach amongst trainers and coaches. It's such an important point that you mentioned the relationship with training and food and using it as a punishment as well, because it's so much about shifting our mindset behind training. I think that's one of the first places that it starts, so that we cultivate that healthy relationship with movement so we can enjoy the movement. And you also cultivate the healthy relationship with food, because so often if we're caught in these unhealthy habits of like binge eating, for example, we're probably searching for some kind of comfort. So if we have self-judgment and shame at the foundation of eating that piece of cake, then we can't enjoy it. So we're not going to get whatever we're seeking in that piece of cake. So we're going to get in that cycle where food becomes this thing that we're trying to fill something from, but it's going to remain empty. So we keep chasing it, and then we'll keep that cycle of the punishment of the exercise for the lack of fulfillment of the sugary carbs that we're eating.
Yeah. And then that it's almost like it just cycles back and forth, because when you exercise, then you feel like you've put yourself through such a punishment that makes you, whether it's part of it's physical, of course, but part of it's psychologically, that you then start to crave the very thing that triggered you to exercise super hard, the sugary treat or whatever it is that you wanted to burn off in the first place.
Yep.
It's cyclical. And so it's much healthier, and it's not easy. These are things that everybody struggles with. I mean, if it were easy, everybody would be super fit, super healthy, super aligned with their own human nature. They'd be moving freely, but how many people say, I'm not a physical person, or I don't exercise? Yes, you are. If you're human, you are made to move. You need to move. And there's some dysfunction. It could be something traumatic. It could be just your psychological conditioning growing up. It could be some interaction you had with somebody in high school. It could just be a lifestyle that you got used to that started, forcing you to identify as somebody who's not physical, but that's not in your nature. In every single human being's nature, we are physical. Now, does that mean the type of physical activity that helps you express yourself is the same as everyone else? No. That's why people do choose different things. My problems with what people choose come from when they think they're choosing it for well-being. Like people, if you want to do, let's take animal flow for an example. Animal flow is a system, a ground-based movement system that I find really fun. I find it really fun and expressive to perform, and I really like teaching it because it's a well thought out system, and I like teaching stuff like that. But doing animal flow is not optimal for everything physically healthy and well when it comes to biomechanics. It's just not. And so I do animal flow because I like it. There are other people who do their exercises because they just want to be healthy. I want to be stronger. I want to be more fit. I want to feel better. I want to have a clearer mind. And if those are your reasons for working out, pretty much every way of working out that is in the mainstream is the wrong way to approach that. I know bold claims, but you said we're all about bold claims here.
All
Everything:
the bold claims.
bodybuilding, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, CrossFit, cycling, rowing, you name it, it's not helping you train to be an optimally fit and free and functional human being, regardless of what you've been taught about what it means to be functional. And so you have to decide. This is another self-honesty exercise. It's like, do I go and do I do heavy deadlifts weekly or however often? Do I do that because I think that a deadlift is the best way to be functionally strong and I want to support that in myself? Or do I just really love deadlifts? And if you really love deadlifts, I can accept that. If you think the deadlift is a super awesome functional exercise and you're just doing it because you want to be a better human being, there are better ways. There are better ways, and I would not recommend deadlifting unless you just love that lift for some reason.
I know I do. So
Yeah,
my
you love the
background,
deadlift?
I do love the deadlift. My background is a lot of CrossFit, and this episode stemmed from a side conversation last week where it was basically bicep curls are stupid, prove me wrong. And so from the beginning of CrossFit in the early days, complex weight movements were the main form of exercise when it came to weightlifting, and things like bicep curls were very much frowned upon. And so for me, this has changed and evolved, but now I still have that conditioning from over a decade ago that movements like bicep curls are just this kind of bro movement that you do in the gym where you're staring at yourself in the mirror. And I've really had a hard time to detach from that image. But as we were discussing behind the scenes, you are so much more in favor of something like bicep curls and that isolated movement over the complex multiple joint movements with Olympic weightlifting.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's not entirely true, but I don't think I expressed myself accurately when we were chatting. I think what I do know for sure is that I would train a bicep curl before I trained a deadlift. But it's not like I think with functional fitness and that approach, because that was the same around the same time as when I was experimenting with CrossFit. I didn't join a CrossFit box or anything, but like the concept of CrossFit and the paleo primal stuff, like around 2009 is exactly when I was sort of getting into it as well. So I think the ethos were there for both of us. And it makes sense in that was a reaction to bodybuilding style lifting, because bodybuilding is a sport, and the objective of that sport is to look a certain way, right? To the judges, it's an aesthetics based sport. So what bodybuilders do is they isolate joints or they isolate muscle groups so that they can work on just that muscle group, because they need each piece of their body to look a certain way proportionally to the other piece so that they look good and win a bodybuilding competition. That's what bodybuilding is. But bodybuilding became the cornerstone of all strength training. And so what the CrossFit people did and the primal paleo people did was say, if you want to lift to be stronger, you shouldn't be just isolating the biceps and curling them by just moving the elbow joint. You should be training all pulling muscles together because that's how the body works. That's not wrong. And I agree with that idea completely. I agree with compound movements over isolated movements. Sometimes you need to isolate to work on like the stability or the strength of a certain joint that might be giving you a problem. Like you need to address your weakest link sometimes. But the idea that the human body works in a compound fashion was progressive and correct of the CrossFit people. What I'm saying is there's a shift in the paradigm, and there are some people and some systems that are getting this right, or as right as we can possibly get it now. And the conversation is shifting to they didn't go far enough with what it actually means to have a compound movement be quote unquote functional. So there are people like, or systems like functional patterns and one of a kind fitness that are asking the right questions. Why would you train this if the human body is supposed to be moving in this way? And one of their big things is the thing I was talking earlier, is that every type of training you do wants to relate to the gait cycle. And that just means the pattern of running. So we look at what does the human body have to do to run perfectly? And if something competes with that, why would you train it in that way? If the body is supposed, so I'll give you an example. If we take the deadlift, because I think it's easier for people to picture. If we take the deadlift, and again, the CrossFit primal people said, okay, we don't care about bicep curls and then doing like lat pull downs and then doing some, isolating these like half range of motion back muscle squeeze movements. We want to train the whole backside as it works to pick something up off the ground. To pick something up off the ground is really functional. So we train a heavy deadlift. That's powerlifting. Here's the problem with the deadlift. What they didn't think of was where is the weight when you're picking up a barbell? And if you can think about what humans would have picked up, like we can think about this intuitively through the ancestral lens of what would our ancestors have done. We can think about it that way, and that's okay. But even if we think about it that way, what would anybody have picked up that is on a bar or in the shape of a barbell with the weight centered in front of the shins that you pick up with both hands with the palms facing the ground? It's not
A pig Sorry. A spit roasted pig.
If you pick up a pig, where are your hands going to be facing? Are your palms going to be facing down and you're going to like grab it by the top of its skin? Like you would in a bed, or are you going to scoop it under and you're going to have your palms facing up, and then you're going to kind of deadlift, but you're more likely going to squat. It's going to be like a half squat, half deadlift. So like the strong men who pick up the stones, that's the more accurate way of how a human would pick things up. And so the right idea of using lots of like multi-joint movements, lots of muscle groups at once to do a function, but how we execute that function it's contrived. It's just made up. Like a barbell is an instrument that's not even 100 years old. I don't think, don't quote me on that. Well, this is live, so anyone can quote me on that, but it's the best that we can do in a controlled setting, even though that's not even the case, because you have the trap bar. So even if you were just to switch to the trap bar, which is that kind of like hexagonal shaped thing, for those of you who don't know what it is, and you stand in the middle of it and then you grab the two sides, just the distribution of the weight resembles something like you would kind of half squat, half deadlift down to grab two things with either hand. And that's going to be much closer to how a human is supposed to pick things up. The second question with the deadlift is, what are you supposed to do with the weight after you pick it up? Because when you deadlift a barbell, all you do is put it down. And if you're talking about, well, our ancestors needed to pick things up off the ground and lift heavy things, like, yeah, then what did they do with it? Because energy was precious in those times. And you better believe nobody was just picking super heavy stuff up just to drop it down and then do it again 3 minutes later. So what were you picking up? How were you holding it? And what were you doing? You were probably carrying it somewhere or throwing it somewhere to get it somewhere. So these are all the questions that I think were never asked, and they just weren't thought through when people thought about barbell squats, barbell deadlifts, bench presses, and then the Olympic lifts like the clean and jerk and the snatch. It's like, what happens after you lift the weight if you want to cite ancestral origins, if that makes sense.
This is such a good breakdown of really looking at what functional fitness is, because this is precisely why I have gotten more interested in odd object training and rucking, is because you have objects that aren't perfect and you're not in a controlled environment. Like when you are out in the wilderness, or if you're in the military and you need to actually like carry someone, or you're chopping wood or whatever it is, you shoot an animal and you're carrying it somewhere. Like, it's not going to be in the shape of a bar. It's not going to be perfectly evenly distributed. You're going to have so much asymmetry going on in how you need to move with it.
That is such a great point. And it all goes back to the moving with it. There is, I mean, I just have images in my mind of every example you just gave, and not one of them involves both sides of the body doing the same thing at the same time. And so when we look at things like, I'll just use the deadlift again as an example, deadlift being what we would refer to as bilateral hip extension, which means the hips are coming from a place of being back behind the rib cage and moving forward, but they're doing it both at the same time. But when we walk, it's one foot in front of the other. When we run, one hip is coming up into flexion when the knee comes up and the hip comes up, and the other leg is pushing off into hip extension. So if we want to be better at things that really matter, like if you have to save someone, or if you have to escape from something, or if you have to move something somewhere, it always involves locomotion. It always involves getting a person or a thing or yourself from point A to point B. And so if you're training something like a deadlift all the time, where you're training bilateral hip extension and training your nervous system to feel the heels digging into the ground and pushing both heels, and that's where your strength comes from, your hip extension strength. But you have that pattern in your nervous system is not going to transfer over to a faster sprint necessarily. For some, there's a window where that it helps many athletes. But if you want to optimize for that movement, you want to train movement that looks at, okay, I'm training one side hip flexion, one side hip extension, or the range of motion of a squat does not need to be all the way down to the ground under load. You don't need a weight on your back if you're all the way down into a deep squat. It's not normal. The squat is a resting position for us. And if we're going to train the squatting position, we want to look at, well, how far down does the human body go to run? How much hip, ankle, knee flexion do I need? So it's just things, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you're listening and you're like, oh, what are all these anatomical terms? That's really not the point. I won't go into any more of it. The point is just that as we look at how we've been conditioned, that these movements are just normal, like, oh, this is how you get stronger. It works your back, it works your glutes. The next step in the evolution of the paradigm of functional fitness is, okay, but how, I know that this movement engages these muscles and these joints, but how are they supposed to work together with the rest of the body? In what patterns is the hip actually supposed to extend? What joint actions accompany that hip action? Like, what's the knee supposed to be doing? What's one side of the body supposed to be doing while the other side does this action? And then creating that context around it, and not just saying, oh, it's compound, it works a lot at the same time, so it's functional.
So once we have that foundational movement built into our lives, then our next step is to apply some powerful questions to figure out why we really are moving the way that we are, and what our goals really are behind the movement that we're focused on.
That's a very eloquent way of putting it. Yes.
Well, I think that we have given the listeners a lot to munch on. I know for me that as I've been getting back into a more intentional movement routine, I feel like I have a few things that I need to look at to work on my forward locomotion. And I'm curious if you have some suggestions for our listeners to create some kind of ideal training plan within their lives. Like, what would an ideal week look like in what you're training and how?
Sure. A great way to close. This is a good, let's give some tangible examples for the listeners. Um, so I can give an example. I can kind of go through what I do and how I prioritize my training. I'll also give you resources to look into how to do this training a little bit more effectively if you want to dive deep into it. When I one of the things that I do all the time is think about and map out different routines, different training schedules for that fit into different contexts of different lifestyles, and I experiment on myself, and I have kind of a library of potential training routines that could apply to different periods or stages of whatever I'm going through or whatever the rest of my life looks like. I take a lot from Dr. Peter Attia, who is one of the leading researchers on longevity. He's a medical doctor, but he's on all sorts of big name podcasts, and his all his research is about fitness and physical habits that support longevity. And he and some others, whose names escape me at the moment, but there's a lot of research on zone 2 cardio. So they divide the cardio intensities into zones, and zone 1 is you're not exercising, you're just walking. Zone 2 is kind of the most or the lowest level that you can exercise while still exercising. So it's about 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. And what a lot of people say is subjectively, you can figure out if you're in zone 2 if you can just barely complete like a 10 to 15 word sentence in one breath. And so for a lot of people who exercise, that could be like a moderate hike. So you're breathing a little bit more intensely than walking, but it doesn't feel like the same as a run or a jog even. So it's pretty low intensity cardio. And that's the stuff that, according to the research, we want about 90 to 180 minutes of it weekly. So I get at the low end, to be honest, because there's a lot of other stuff that I like to do, but I'll do about 2 45-minute zone 2 sessions in a week. I will strength train 2 to 3 times a week, and those are strength training protocols that, in my opinion, support optimal movement. Now, it's all an experiment for everybody, and it should be, because what works for you doesn't necessarily work for someone else. And I don't just mean physically. I mean, you just might hate an exercise so much that it's nearly impossible for you to put forth the effort and intentionality that you need to get the most out of that exercise. So I'm not saying I have all the answers and that my strength training method is the best, but I do try to keep it to training that supports movement patterns that are going to make me feel the best in my body. I will do some heavier lifting that wouldn't fit into those paradigms, but they make up a small percentage of my training so that the input to my nervous system is still going to optimize for the movement that, in my opinion, is best, makes me the best physical human. And then all of the training that I do, because it is important for longevity to maintain muscle mass, and to have strength. And sometimes you just want to lift a heavy thing. And so as long as I'm not doing that to the point where the input is overriding the input for all the other stuff, it's okay. So maybe I'll include those lifts like once a week maximum, maybe once every 2 weeks. I'll just do a couple different, more like traditional, a heavy row machine or chest press or I will stay away from traditional lower body lifts because every input that I put into the ground with my feet, I want to be very intentional. But the point is 2 to 3 times a week, I'll do something that's oriented with resistance training. A couple days a week, I'll do movement training that I enjoy. So it could be animal flow, and it could be martial arts training. So I'll do like a heavy bag workout. I'll just hit the bag. I usually couple that with a zone 2 workout. So I might do half an hour of, incline walking and then half an hour of bag training. And my mornings are sprinkled with mobility. I don't think stretching is super important or necessarily super functional for most people. So if there's certain joints that I know I just want to improve a certain range on, I'll work on that. And I will do some myofascial release stuff with like a lacrosse ball, so that my mornings are kind of sprinkled with that. And I think I covered it. I think one day a week I'll do like zone 5 intervals. So I won't do a super intense interval training workout more than once a week. I think we really need it. It's a way to kind of test my running mechanics under higher intensity and to get that anaerobic threshold training, which is just basically the point at which you reach your VO2 max, or the most oxygen that you can absorb and actually use, that your body can do that with, before it starts to just level out and stay the same. So yeah, some combination of resistance training that is supportive to the movement patterns that are right for you, that are right for humans, and then as much zone 2 low intensity cardio as possible. One day a week of those anaerobic threshold high intensity intervals, no more than 30 minutes. And then something else that you love, if there's something else that you love, whatever it is, a sport, dancing, animal flow, martial arts, sprinkled throughout the week when you can and want to. And that's it.
Amazing. Definitely something tangible that we can take out of this and apply some action steps to.
Yeah, for sure. And if people want to dive more deeply into how to execute some of this stuff, I recommend Peter Attia's podcast. If you're into the health and longevity side of things, I think it's called The Drive. And if you're looking at some of the strength training, you can look at functional patterns. That's kind of like, they're leading the industry right now in this kind of fringe biomechanics approach to fitness and training. And there's also a lesser known system called One of a Kind Fitness by a guy named Devin Brown. And he's I don't really hear many people talking about what he's talking about. He's got something unique going on, and the questions that he asks and the explanations that he has for why patterns need to go certain ways, I haven't heard too many, if any, great arguments against him. And I really champion his system and I use it a lot. And so if you want to dive deep into this stuff, I love coaching people. And I also do consults. So for people who just want more of the philosophical or the big picture stuff and want to apply it yourself, that's an option too.
I'm glad that you plugged yourself, because I was going to interrupt you at some point and say that if anyone really wants to dive deep, you are the person to book. And anyone that decides to go down that path, you will be in amazing hands.
Thank you, Savannah. Appreciate that. If you're interested in a little more information on just musings on this stuff, you can also go to my podcast. I have a solo podcast that I update sometimes, called the Moves with Coombs podcast. So you can head there. But other than that, that's all the time I think we have for this longer episode. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Savannah, as always, for being a great co-host.
Thank you for letting us into the depths of your brain. I think that we could go on about this for hours, but we'll give our listeners a small break before we continue.
Yes, I could talk about this stuff for hours. So, as always, listeners, If you'd like to hear more about this stuff, let us know. Be happy to oblige. But also, if there are any other ideas you have based on the stuff that we already talk about and you think would be something you'd like to hear about on this podcast, please reach out to us on social media. We love hearing from you. We love when you engage with us. It's not just a dialogue, but we hope for it to be an open conversation with everybody out there as well. So you can find me at moves_with_Coombs on Instagram. And you can find Savannah at Primal Revolutions.
See you next time, and enjoy moving your body with intention.